Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, along with my partner in crime. Is this a crime, Jessica? No.
I hope not.
Okay, I hope not. It must be a crime somewhere. But anyway, how you doing, Jess?
I'm doing great. I'm ready to rock. Can't wait to talk
Stone.
to Elizabeth. This is a fantastic interview. We're so excited.
Yes, I am excited. And we are co-produced by my pal, Tristan Drew. And if you like, have you hit that subscribe button, Jess?
Wait, smash it. No, you got to smash the subscribe button.
What did that subscribe button ever do to you? Why are you hitting it? Anyway, leave us a review and comments on iTunes and wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a shout on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you. And as you already heard, our guest today is Elizabeth Neumann. This is really exciting for all of us. Elizabeth Neumann served in George W. Bush's administration initially in faith-based and community initiatives, and then was part of the Homeland Security Council when it was first being formed post 9/11. She later went on to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff at the Department of Homeland Security in Donald Trump's administration under General John Kelly, and then Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and eventually a revolving door, it seemed like, of acting secretaries. But it was under Secretary Nielsen that Elizabeth transitioned to being Assistant Secretary of Threat Prevention and Security Policy, which must have been a unique vantage point to have seen threats that ultimately metastasized on January 6th, which we'll be sure to talk more about. But in April of 2020, Elizabeth not only resigned her post, she became a vocal critic of former President Trump and many of his policies. And she's now part of the Republican Accountability Project, which recently published the GOP Democracy Report Card, something that I am passionate about. I'm so glad that folks are doing this work. And I can't wait to ask more about. Elizabeth, this is such an honor. This is such a thrill. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me. I love the theme of this podcast because we need more of this. This is actually how we get to a healthier place in our country.
We need more of people agreeing with me. That's what we need.
It was the whole talking about politics without killing each other. That part is good.
Okay. All right. I think we can
forget
do that.
Religion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Religion and politics. Yeah.
Yes.
We've been talking about trying to get you on the show for a while. And one of the things that really sort of crystallized that for me anyway, was your interview in the Politico magazine about violent Christian extremism. But the perspectives that you shared in there are based on how you grew up. And I think we want to start there. Can you talk a little bit about your upbringing in terms of religion and politics?
Sure. I grew up in the Dallas, Texas area, actually north of Dallas, in at the time, a small community. It's much bigger now. So I grew up going to actually multiple churches. My family was kind of unique in that sense. It probably helped me be able to be more of a skeptic earlier than maybe some, although I still think that it took me a little too long to realize how much my politics and faith had merged. But because we would try different churches, I was exposed to different church communities, different theological traditions. And
give us the spectrum, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
From where to where were you exposed? Where are you on the continuum?
Well, a lot of Bible churches. My parents met at a small Bible church that was started by some seminarians out of Dallas Theological Seminary in the late 60s. And, if you look at that time period, denominations were kind of on the downtrend. Mm-hmm. And there was also this heated conversation happening around kind of almost the liberalization of the study of scripture. And so one of the counter swings was this tradition to go right back to the text and to, read the text and interpret the text as it is written as opposed to what was also happening where, what would be considered a liberal theological exposition of the Bible, where certain things are metaphors and not actually true. Like Jesus wasn't really the Son of God. It was a conservative Bible church that where my parents met. And they were closer into the city. That church was closer into the city. So when we ended up kind of out in the suburbs, we ended up going to a different church in that community. So we tried a Bible church in the community that we were living in, which was McKinney. We tried another Bible church later in life. And in between, I would go with friends to like the local Baptist church, which by the way, now is a mega church, Prestonwood Baptist Church. And when I went to school in Austin, University of Texas at Austin, I went to a PCA church. So all kind of in that conservative spectrum, slightly different worship styles from the contemporary to the more liturgical and traditional, especially when you get into the Presbyterian range. But that's kind of where I came out of.
Can I ask you about the role of women and how you were taught about the role of women in that context?
I was so blessed to come out of a family where, from my grandfather to my parents, at a very young age, you can do whatever you want to do, right? Like it was just instilled in me that, work hard, get a good education, and you can be whatever you want to be. When you're a young kid, you don't understand why that is so unique, especially in the South. Even though we're talking about the 80s, that was pretty unique for that time period. I went to a private Christian school from second grade to 12th grade. And I remember being in high school and, this is the age where you are introduced to concepts in class and then you're supposed to debate them. And outside of class, we would have these debates about whatever the topic was, but it would inevitably come back around to, women can't be a leader of a company, or women can't be a leader in government because they have to submit to their husband, and they can't lead a church. So why could they lead the country? And now, no teacher ever said this, and this is certainly not what my parents taught me. But it was fascinating to me that there were clearly people in my peer group where this was the norm, and you saw this play out. We had for the time period, and it's still a very good school, but for the time period, pretty rigorous, critical thinking curriculum. And we had a few kids every year. Somebody goes to a couple of the Ivies. Like, it produces good students, but by and large, most everybody chooses to stay in Texas. And I remember as we were doing the college search tour, I just was so gravitating towards schools on the East Coast. And my mom and I joke about this now, but we went to University of Virginia's campus, and I was clearly smitten. And of course, she was like, Elizabeth, I just so see this as like a place that you would thrive in. And I was a rebellious teen at the time, so that meant that I could not go there.
Oh man,
I liked it. So we joke now. I'm like, I wish I had either you had not said that, or that I had, been a more respectful child. Anyway, so I ended up going to the University of Texas at Austin, which ended up giving me the opportunity to work on the Bush campaign. God had his plan, but I still wish I'd had that very different collegiate experience at UVA. But the reason I tell that story is that like, from early ages, I could just tell I didn't quite fit into the Dallas community. That doesn't mean, my family's still there. I love people there. My husband and I moved back there for 2 years to be closer to my family. This is right before we moved back to DC this recent time. But there was just something about the culture where I didn't quite fit. And some of it had to do with a Christian subculture that it de-emphasized the role that women can play in society. And they didn't quite know what to do with leaders. I remember being at the church that I attended in college, and a good friend of mine, who by the way was like valedictorian in her class, super smart, graduates early, what does she decide to do? She volunteers at our church to do, I want to say, youth ministry. And there was another guy, her counterpart, she was ministering to the girls, he's ministering to the guys, and just like their skill set, she was administratively, really gifted and could have led that effort much better. But because he was the guy and he was going to go be a pastor someday, they kept giving him the work. Now, she was fine with that. Like it wasn't like she was pushing back on it. She was much more graceful than I was, especially at that age. But it just, I remember watching that going, this makes no sense. Like, she is so gifted. Why are they not using those gifts? It wouldn't have meant that she was, even if, people have different views on egalitarianism and complementarianism, it wouldn't have violated the core principle of complementarianism that a male should be teaching as head of the church. It wouldn't have violated that at all. But there was built into this system the idea that we need to invest in the men, and I don't know what to do with the women. And I think there are complementarian churches that are doing better at this now than they were 25 years ago. But there was an absolute signal of, hey, ladies, you might love the Lord, but if you have this leadership set of skills, we don't know what to do with you. And that was fine. I was interested in government, but it also made me not feel at home. Like people just didn't know what to do with me in that culture.
Yeah, I'm sure that Corey has questions, but I feel like a kindred spirit to you just 5 minutes in here. Yeah. This is, and Corey knows because he's read my book, which talks a lot about the same kind of set of dynamics. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, and it was so much cultural Christianity. And if you didn't completely buy into it, you were not one of them. I think what I'm hearing is there was like an early sense of justice and injustice in how you viewed that was a little bit different than the sense of justice and injustice around you. And I wonder if at all that was part of your draw to government service or part of your interest in the forces that make people, be extreme thinkers on one side or the other.
That's a really interesting way you frame that question. And I laughed because I don't know that before, say, 3 or 4 years ago, I appreciated that how important justice is to me. And it was going to my children's parent-teacher conferences. And my son is 2 years ahead of my daughter. So we picked up pretty quickly from teachers, like he has a strong sense of justice, and okay, we'll work with making sure that he appropriately communicates that, as opposed to, being a little bit of a, like, this is the way it's supposed to be. And, the good side to that, of course, is he defends people who are vulnerable. Well, then my daughter comes into school, and sure enough, within the first parent-teacher conference is only 6 weeks into school. And so we went to back-to-back conferences, and both teachers for both kids are like, they have a strong sense of justice. So we might, want to help them with the appropriate way of channeling that great energy. My husband and I are looking at each other like, okay, we might need to tone it down a little bit at home too. Clearly this is being learned as well. So yes, I apparently do have a strong sense of justice and injustice and wanting to right what is wrong. I am certainly earlier in my career, I had to learn how to be more patient with how slow processes work in government, and that that comes with a good side, especially when you're a political appointee. Like the beauty of the system where you have civil servants and political appointees. Civil servants keep things steady. They're managing programs. They're there for the long haul. Political appointees, put it in today's terminology, can often be disruptors, and you can do good disruption. Sometimes we do need things shaken up. As we saw in the last 4 years, sometimes too much disruption produces a lot of chaos, and you are not able to make as much progress as you might have hoped. But certainly coming into the federal system and working on national security issues, post 9/11 mission is very, very much a part of what drives me. Trying to keep the country safe, and especially now that we're 20 years post 9/11, trying to be honest about where we weren't as successful as we thought, where we made wrong calls about the right way to keep us safe. Thankfully, we really have not seen another terrorist attack the size and scale of 9/11. So by that metric, we were successful. But if you speak to communities, especially the Muslim community in the United States, they still feel a great sense of scrutiny and marginalization. And we need to learn from that and make sure we don't repeat those mistakes, especially as we're facing the next threat, the emerging threat of violent white supremacism and anti-government extremism.
You were part of the Homeland Security Council in the years just after 9/11 and the Department of Homeland Security when it was first being formed. I'm interested if you can compare and contrast your experience early on in the Bush years compared to your year, like especially the last year or so. It seems like in the Trump administration was like Trump bad man on steroids.
The impression I have of that first period before 9/11 was it was professional, it was organized. They were very disciplined, and George W. Bush as a personality is just a very disciplined person, has the same morning routine, and that filtered down. When I eventually worked at the White House, I was the assistant to the first Homeland Security advisor, John Gordon. This is after Tom Ridge goes to stand up the Department of Homeland Security. So Tom Ridge was there, he leaves, and John Gordon becomes the Homeland Security advisor, and I got to be his executive assistant. And so I was working in the West Wing, and there was just such a rhythm and routine. It was a long day, but very disciplined, very organized. Post 9/11, certainly the agenda shifted dramatically. I was still working on faith-based initiatives. So all of a sudden you saw it was the air sucked out of the room, and you're like, okay, I guess we're not working on education issues and faith-based issues. I mean, they eventually started working more on domestic agendas, but rightly, all hands on deck were focused on what did we need to do to protect the country and find bin Laden. But even there, even in the, there's always a fog of war chaos aspect to it. There was still a discipline and an organization, and you knew who was in charge. I'm not saying that there wasn't backbiting or infighting. There always is in Washington, D.C. It's a city made of egos and power-driven people. So there's always going to be that element to it. But when you have somebody at the top, and his chief of staff at the time, Andy Card, also really emphasized this to us as a staff. This is not about you. This is about the American people. When I left, I did my departure photo, and my family got to come into the Oval Office. We got to meet the president. It was really special. And I had not been in the Oval Office before. I was really just so taken by the moment. And I remember saying to the president, it's just been such an honor to serve you. And he was like, Elizabeth, you didn't serve me. You served the American people. I'm not getting my George W. Bush voice right. But like that has stuck with me, right? Like, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I serve the American people. That is so different than what the Trump team was about. The reason I probably got into the Trump administration is because of the person that recruited me ended up being the chief of staff to John Kelly, and they were so desperate for getting anybody with experience in that they didn't do much scrubbing.
I heard they had to ask you like 3 times before you accepted.
Yeah. Well,
you had reservations. It sounds like going in.
Oh, very much. My husband still will bring it up, like, our life could be a lot happier and healthier if we were still in Texas. My family still wishes that's what it was. No, like the 2 days after the election, I got a phone call. I'm like, nope, not interested. I mean, I thought about it for 30 seconds. And I was like, nope, not, my kids are young. I'm not a big fan of his. Like, nope, not interested.
But you did vote for Trump in 2016. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you had reservations.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the kind of thing that if I had voted the next day, I might have changed my mind. I mean, Texas was going red. He was going to win Texas. So in some ways it was like, it
was more of a symbolic vote.
And goodness, like that period of time, I wasn't paying too close attention to the election. There was a bit of, we had left DC and I was trying to decompress, and we had lived in Denver and Seattle, and we were in Dallas at the time that the election started picking up in 2015. And vaguely aware of some of the grotesque comments that Trump had made on the campaign trail, but again, like the conventional wisdom was, there is no way this man can win. I remember people asking me, my family in Texas, what do you think about Trump running? I was like, don't worry, there's no way. It's just like, there is no possible way this works. Yeah. So when he got the nomination, there were a lot of conversations like, what do we do? Like, this is so, not the Republican Party that we've all belonged to. And it really was, I think for many, the kind of this shaking and awakening of, and what we would call a political realignment, right? Like there was a way that Republican Christian politics was supposed to work. Yeah. And 2016 did not go by that playbook. And so there was just a lot of wrestling of how do we reconcile this? Do we still vote based on pro-life and abortion, even though this man has no character and is not consistent with biblical values? So my husband and I read a lot of thinkers and theologians and all that kind of stuff. He came down on the side of, I'm just writing a candidate in. Several members of my family did that. I don't know. I still regret the vote. Maybe it was supposed to be, because I probably wouldn't have been able to work in the administration if I had written in a candidate. Because they did ask that question, who did you vote for? And I wasn't going to lie. But yeah, by the time you get to the fact that he won, I think that shocked all of us. And then the first ask was an easy no. The second ask, John Kelly had been nominated, and he was impressive. And I was like, oh, it would be nice. Like, he's somebody I could enjoy working for. But no, it's still just the timing's not right. This is not the president I want to associate myself with. And then the third ask was right before the inauguration. And this was a conversation with somebody I trusted that said, I'm very concerned for the safety of our country. They're bringing people in and putting them in positions that do not have the qualifications to do the security work that this department needs to do. Will you please come in? And that's kind of what, look, I was formed by 9/11. It is, and I have enough awareness to recognize that, especially now that we have the next generation of workers in the workplace, like they view the world differently. The mission is not nearly as a guttural reaction as it is for me. But man, you put that on the table of, like, we're concerned that we're not going to be able to keep the homeland safe. You're like, okay, all right, I'll pray about it. And I prayed about it. And a lot of conversations with my husband. Some were more intense than others. And we eventually decided to come in. But it was, in retrospect, it was the right decision. I also hope I never have to do something like that again. It was some of the most difficult years I've ever had.
When I looked at the record, I was surprised that you lasted as long as you did. I mean, it was barely over a year ago that you finally resigned. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that was in part I was not an expert on immigration, so I could avoid those issues. That first year, I genuinely was doing stuff that we don't necessarily find that exciting usually. Schedules and managing the executive secretariat process that gets the papers to the secretary that he has to sign. So that first year was a lot of more operations and management. But the second and third year, when I moved over to the policy office, one of the thing that I couldn't avoid is my team. One of the teams that I was responsible for was the screening and vetting team, and they handled the travel ban implementation. So that there were a whole bunch of things in that executive order that they were responsible for.
You came out of faith-based operations initially. You always in the background, I can tell, have your faith as a guiding principle for how you want to see government work. You also mentioned how Muslims felt so alienated right after 9/11 and still do. So how did watching this messaging around the Muslim ban unfold hit you on a personal level, and you're getting into some of the mistakes that you think were made maybe rhetorically, but was there a valid argument there, but it was just too late?
Let's start with the way that he messaged it was horrible. And here's an interesting fact. He called it the Muslim ban once on a campaign trail. I did not go back and double check this, but a friend of mine did, and they claimed that was the one and only time that he did it, but it stuck, right? Yeah. And it left such a strong impression with the globe that it has hurt.
It was the same ban that Obama had done. It just was rhetorically treated differently.
Yes,
there were many of those same countries in the Muslim ban. Now I'm using it that President Trump initiated, right?
The country list came from a piece of legislation that the Obama administration negotiated with Congress after the series of attacks that kind of were the rise of ISIS in the Western world. That list, you're right, did come out of the Obama era, meaning it negotiated with the Obama administration. He signed off on it. It was legislation that was passed by the Congress. But what Trump did was take it a bit further and made it such that nobody from those countries can come here, and unless you basically get some sort of exemption, and that those exemptions were handled by the State Department. So I never got to understand fully how they were handling them. But the impression I had is that they didn't dole those out very frequently.
And I remember at the time, General Kelly said he didn't even know the EO was coming. So
That's right.
How did it hit you when you found? Did you know it was going to be the disaster that it became?
So I wasn't there yet. I didn't come into DHS until late February, and that executive order dropped, I want to say the second week of the administration. Yeah, it's like January, end of January. But I certainly heard about it from the people that I was talking to. They were like, "This is chaos. This is a nightmare." We didn't know about it. It was an interesting, what's that word, where it's like, it's the foreshadowing of what the entire Trump administration ended up being. They shoot first and then aim later. Yeah. They think that you can take talking points from a campaign trail and make it policy. And there was a sense at the beginning, like, oh, they're just new and they're learning. And you get into about a year of it and you're like, they don't want to learn, or like it's intentional that they're not learning because they want chaos to reign. And they think that's the best business model for them.
I just want to pick up on the empathy that you expressed earlier for the Muslim community in the United States. And so by the time you get into the government and you're watching this unfold with the Muslim ban, are you thinking that this is going to create new extremists or bad feelings towards the government? I mean, it's not exactly a win for the U.S. government to come after the Muslim community with that type of messaging.
Yeah, I think at the time we were more focused on the operational chaos for the department and just
triage.
Just very why this doesn't have to be that hard, and kind of a sense of like the people that have been in government before looking at the people that had not been in government before going, can you guys just let us do our jobs. Sorry, the puppy is getting into something.
We're talking about very serious things, and Noelle, the puppy, is like, I'm having none of it.
Yeah, she's like, let me eat
levity.
your first.
This moment calls for levity.
But you're absolutely right, though, because the dynamic of ostracization and marginalization, really hatred towards certain groups of people that the president kind of aimed at over and over and over again. And he did it with illegal immigration,
right.
Calling migrants criminals and rapists, and it created this perception in America's, collective mind, not of everybody, but certainly if you were listening to that echo chamber of Fox News over and over again, that, a migrant trying to come to the United States is dangerous. And that's actually not true. The facts actually support the opposite, that there's less crime in immigrant communities compared to the average American community. And we now know through some research that any place that Trump would do a rally and use language that was antagonistic to Muslims or to Hispanic communities, immigrant communities, and then at times
towards the end, Asian Americans,
and then Black Lives Matter became more of a thing in the last year as well. Anytime he would say that, you would see hate crimes go up in that community over the next few days.
Wow.
And they've been able to, I'm not an academic research scientist, but you read these studies, they controlled for a whole host of range of explanations. It was not, plausible. It was, there is a direct connection here. He speaks, hate crimes go up. So if you were a member of the Muslim community, if you are Black and brown in this country, for the last 4 years, you have been more ostracized or more feeling more hate than you did before. Now, that's not to say that we haven't battled with it. I mean, it didn't just come about because of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump made it worse. And I remember meeting with a woman at a mosque in the Denver area, and we were talking about a prevention program. I was explaining what we were trying to do. They had been strong partners with one of my staff members that worked out there. So I was thanking them for their partnership. It was a productive conversation. I'm learning things. And at some point, she just was like, I just want to ask you a question, and I don't mean to be rude, but does anybody care that I'm scared to bring my children to services? Does anybody in the government care that my community has been threatened? You guys keep wanting me to help you with your terrorism problem, but what about the fact that my community is being targeted? And I just remember feeling two sucker punched. One, no American should ever have to question whether their government cares about protecting them. And two is the mom thing. Is like, I cannot imagine. I mean, I remember every time there's a church shooting and I go to church the next Sunday, and I'm remembering the exits. I'm remembering, that's just part of, I've watched too many videos. So it's my own personal thing that I have to deal with. But she dealt with that every day. Yeah. And every week. It wasn't just after a shooting. And that has stuck with me. And it's directly related to the environment that he ushered in, where he made it okay to criticize people based on their race or their religion. I have to say that, like, the irony is that he starts his administration with this, I'm going to be tough on terrorism, and I'm going to travel ban. And those of us in conservative national security circles who hadn't been in government, because the Obama administration had been in government, we come back in. They made some plausible arguments at the beginning about why certain restrictions might be needed. It became really clear to me, and to those that I was working with in the national security community, those restrictions were not needed anymore. And we advocated, like, we've done our reviews, we're comfortable that if somebody is coming here and they are known in the world to be associated with terrorism, we're going to find them and we're not going to let them in. Now there's never 100% guarantee, but we're really good at it. And so we don't need those restrictions anymore. And and I was so naive. I really thought, like, if we lay this out and we educate the people that had kind of been advocating for these policies, they'd be like, great, that's wonderful news. I'm so glad. We can take credit. We can tell the American people, we have made you safer. We did what we promised to do. You don't even have to tell them that
actual logic and the record would work. That's
and you don't even have to tell them that it started under the Obama administration. Just take the credit.
Yeah.
Turns out that's not what it was about. And that's why I've spoken out since leaving. Like this, for some, not all, for some in Trump's administration, this was a nativist viewpoint that they were trying to implement through national security policy. This was possibly racist and xenophobic. And they were trying to keep people out, period.
I want to ask you a little bit about that. I'd heard you saying in interviews well before January 6th, even back in early 2020, early to mid 2020, that the threat of domestic terrorism from right-wing extremist groups was much greater, certainly, than that of anything we'd seen or will see from Antifa, as well as from Islamic terrorist threats. I'm curious, how early did you come to that determination, and how did the Trump administration handle those assessments?
We presided over that shift, right? Like where the lines on the graph cross. And I actually went back and looked at the data recently. You could see the growth in extremist groups during the Obama administration, but the government itself doesn't have good data collection on domestic extremist groups. So the government wasn't seeing it. It was the academic researchers and some of the advocacy groups that study hate crimes that were seeing this rise in extremist growth in the groups. So I mentioned that to say there were some within government that raised the alarm as far back as 2009. There's a lot of good. It is completely rational for the citizens and the Congress to question why the government didn't see it sooner. The answer, I think, is actually relatively simple. It's not even an unconscious bias thing. It's that the government didn't have the data, and the government is so predisposed in the security community to trust government data, especially since in the intelligence world, when you're looking overseas, historically, only the government had the ability to do overseas intelligence collection. Now that shifted even in the sense that we're an increasingly global society, and you can collect data from any number of sources now, and you don't necessarily need a high-powered intelligence community. We still do, but you get what I'm saying. In the domestic world, it's kind of flip-flopped. You have these constitutional restrictions, so we can't go and collect data just for data's sake. So in some ways, academics and advocacy groups have a better pulse on what's going on. And so I think that's why we didn't see the shift happening during the last decade. You get to
rhetorically, weren't we really focused on exterior threats or threats that came from a homegrown extremist radicalized by somebody outside the country? But we're still looking outside of our country for those threats.
Absolutely. And there was a lot of focus on online radicalization, but online radicalization being done by ISIS or by an Islamist jihadist terrorist philosophy.
And you've said that the ISIS playbook has actually begun to be used now by domestic extremists.
Absolutely. Today's white nationalists are borrowing from the ISIS playbook. But I don't want to give the impression that the white nationalists are just, showing up and new to the game. If you look at the history of the white power movement, they adopted a decentralized cell structure back in the 1980s, intentionally designed their movement to be leaderless. because they believe they'd be able to operate with more freedom. It would make it harder for law enforcement to break into their cells. So they've been operating that way for decades. They also were early adopters of using the internet to spread propaganda. They stole money through a variety of criminal enterprises to buy computers, give them to their followers, and then they were using the early, like we're talking 1985 to 87 internet to share propaganda in a way that way law enforcement couldn't keep tabs on what was going on in their communities. So they have used the internet for quite some time. The borrowing of the playbook, though, is a reference to the fact that we were seeing people becoming radicalized online. This originally started actually pre-ISIS in 2006. We saw a very active recruiting where people were connecting online and then leaving to go overseas and join a fight somewhere. And then that morphed into, you started to have imams, teachers speak in English to encourage people to join the fight. That was the 2009. Exactly. Yeah. 2009 era. And then eventually they started putting out ISIS and Al-Qaeda magazines that were in English translations and fairly sophisticated videos for their audiences. They became social media content generators, and that drove people being drawn into the movement. And originally, of course, with ISIS, the goal was to get everybody there to the caliphate to help set up the caliphate. Once you had some military pressure on them, the signal was sent, no, don't come here. Do your jihad where you are, bring your own weapon to the fight, find a vehicle, find a knife, find a gun, and go do as much damage in the name of ISIS, right? Like create terror where you are. And that's really when you come into 2015, 2016, when Donald Trump is campaigning, that was coming to the forefront. And it was concerning for the counterterrorism community. It was concerning for the country. So it makes sense that he was talking about these issues. He just was using language that most in the counterterrorism community would be like, this is not helping us in combating this fight. It's actually driving people to feel sorrow and empathy for potentially a violent jihadist approach to their faith. So,
and at the same time, are we seeing white nationalists at that same time building on the progress that ISIS has made in terms of recruiting strategies?
Yeah. So we noticed
16 time period.
I mean, I don't think the government was seeing this. I think some of the outside groups were seeing it. But now looking back, you can see that they were learning from what worked for ISIS. How did you get that person recruited? To the point now, and I have her book here, Cynthia Miller Idris wrote a book called Hate in the Homeland. And it's talking about what she calls the global far right. And by 2019, we're having conversations with our counterparts overseas that they're seeing this phenomenon. They call it right-wing extremism. The right-wing extremist movement recognizes that the way to recruit is through rather mainstream means, concerts, music. They have posted a series of YouTube videos on cooking. So here's cooking classes, and you go to.
Sorry, what's the intersection between white supremacy and cooking?
Well, she explains like there is kind of this go back to the that like it's a vegan lifestyle of going back to the basics of the way it was intended. So there's this intermix of things that you might not necessarily think, like you think of a vegan and you tend to think like, oh, they're probably liberal in their belief system, but like it's all intermixed now. And so they do these cooking shows, and maybe by the third video, they introduce some concepts that you would not necessarily know are white supremacist of ideology, but you're already kind of connecting to them as a cooking show. So you keep watching, and by the end, they've kind of got a pitch that you might actually be like open to, right? Of like, you know what, we are getting replaced. You know what, like life is changing too fast, and we need to be proud of who we are. And so they're very persuasive in their messaging. It is not, you're not going to see today's white supremacist extremist with a bunch of tattoos and a skinhead. Like they're going to wear khaki pants, like what we saw in Charlottesville. They are trying to be like the dressed up, polished version of white supremacy. And so they're not always obvious about what they're recruiting you into, because they want you to find your belonging with them before they maybe introduce some of the more grotesque concepts. But anyway, that's kind of the biggest challenge we have right now is how seductive they can be.
And I want to pivot from there to the discussion that we were starting as well with the recruitment inside seeker-sensitive churches.
Yes. Read my mind. Yeah.
And so
it seems like there was fertile ground already happening with, and to describe to our audience what seeker sensitives, this was a movement in I guess the late 90s, the early 2000s, where there was just a massive evangelical push, and it didn't really matter if people were discipled, which would be sort of learning the underlying theology, getting into community. It was really just a numbers game that a lot of churches went through. They would, the preachers would talk a lot about very basic 1, 2, 3, 4 steps to get saved. And from there, you were a member, then we counted you as a member. So now then we have this big church and we can take credit for all of these souls. But you argue in that Politico article that really ripened the scene for conspiracies like white supremacy, like QAnon, and other kinds of anti-government ideologies to conflate with cultural Christianity and confuse people into thinking that everything's the same, and that that they need to do these things to be a Christian. Am I kind of encapsulating it?
Yes. So the argument I was making with seeker friendly was that you basically were giving people just enough, and they think they've checked the box. And there was a study done by Willow Creek, which is kind of like the preeminent, poster child of seeker friendly churches. They did a study in like 2008, I want to say, to assess how they were doing. And they were very honest. They were like, we are not creating disciples. And of course, that is what Christ called us to, is not go get followers to come to a church, or go get somebody to listen to your sermon. We were called to go and make disciples. And they were very honest that they have not done well with that they needed to change their approach. But my thesis is kind of like, if you've done this initial groundwork where you've invited people in and that becomes their community, it's just that they're not like going to the text. They're not reading the Bible. They're not studying scripture. They're not actually learning, hey, in community, you actually have to work through conflict and offer forgiveness and be humble and go through all of that. They talk about iron sharpening iron. Like it can be painful work to be in a biblical community. It's not all, potlucks and, baseball, Little League baseball. Like it is kind of, it can be gritty if you're doing it right. And of course, in our communities, there's that phenomenon of that Robert Putnam calls in his book, Bowling Alone. We are increasingly just more and more isolated, and doing real community is the kind of like not something that we prize or do well anymore. And so there's probably societal things that are happening at this time that are feeding into it. And plus you have this rise of a Christian subculture where people are getting a little dose of Christianity, but not enough to actually truly transform them. So when somebody comes along, like they've outsourced all of their discipleship, right? Like all I have to do is listen to the next celebrity preacher, and then I'm going to learn like how to have a good life. And it becomes very much about how do I get what I need for me, as opposed to, what an actual disciple of Christ comes to learn is following Christ means you're carrying a cross daily. It's not about you. It's not about achieving your best life now. So there's this culture that we've created, and I think we've seen it on display in the last two elections. And the non-Christian part of America thinks that that's what Christianity is, that it's that people that are believing in a health, wealth, prosperity gospel. It's people believing in whatever the next celebrity Christian tells them. And so you had this confluence of charismatic, which is different than evangelical, who were prophesying that Trump was
all white
Cyrus. Yes. And, yes, he doesn't look like he is a secular king, but he is going to do great things for us, Israel, America, the new Israel. It allows, there's a
replacement theology.
Yeah, exactly. Replacement theology, dominionism, Seven Mountain dominionism, all of which are taking parts of scripture and perverting it. And you have to go into the weeds to get into some detail to understand how and where they twisted it and perverted it. And if you are not grounded, if you have just done that surface level, I show up to church and my kids get some good youth stuff, and that's what Christianity is to you, you're open to these quasi-spiritual arguments. You're open to being told, well, if you're a good Christian, you have to vote a Republican. So then when somebody comes along and says, I know he doesn't look like a good Christian, but he's going to get us the judges, that seems like a plausible argument. And so you
convinced a lot of people,
and you don't have the tools necessarily to go any deeper and to say, shouldn't there be something more? Or what about the fact that he doesn't treat people kindly? Does that matter at all? Does it matter?
Yeah. What about the fruit of the Spirit?
Yeah. And look, this is not to diminish. There were some very good grounded teachers who wrestled with this in 2016 and 2020, and they came to a place where they held their nose and voted for him. I kind of put that in a separate category than the people that embraced and proudly advocated for him, to the point where they made you feel like you are a lost soul. I mean, I was personally told when I came out in support of Biden that I have blood on my hands because of the abortion issue, and I understand and appreciate where they're coming from. I wish that they could have a mindset that was open enough to know that, like, I was very, very much on my knees before the Lord. And I feel very much with a clear conscience that I don't have blood on my hands. And what does that mean? Is it possible that believers might be able to have different perspectives on how we vote? And it might not just be one specific issue of abortion. And that's not to minimize the importance of addressing abortion. But there was definitely a groupthink that developed over the last few decades around primarily the abortion issue. And when you have an entire subculture that is not grounded in the word, they do not read it for themselves. They follow the whims of whatever the latest celebrity teacher is. And I'm not talking like an in-depth Bible study teacher. I'm talking the, how to fix your life in 3 easy steps teacher. It is not, it's not deep. And you go to those metaphors of like, what happens to a plant that is not planted by the water? It withers and it dies when the heat comes. And we are called to be deeply rooted in God's word. There are consequences when the church invested so many years in a seeker-friendly movement that didn't actually disciple people. It left them, to use the parable that Christ used of scattering the seeds. These were the seeds that sprouted up quickly and withered, or were sprouted planted in the rocks and were choked out by life because they didn't have the roots to endure.
Right. Wow. I feel like we can go for hours here because you're touching on a lot of things that I'm personally grappling with. For example, the abortion issue. Is it possible for me to collaborate and cooperate with folks who, I personally believe that life starts at conception, but is it possible for me to collaborate with folks who don't have that belief, but do have a desire for what I would think of as sort of a holistic pro-life? Do we care about the immigrant? Do we care about the widow and the orphan? Things from Hebrew Bible all the way through what Jesus taught us. So you've given me a great deal to think about, but we only have a few minutes left, and I want to be sure for you to tell us and our audience the work that you're doing with the Republican Accountability Project and the GOP Democracy Scorecard.
Yes. So, look, I have always considered myself a security person, not a political person. It was a huge step for me to speak out during a campaign. I felt like it was the right thing to do. I felt like it was needed for security purposes. I was very concerned what 4 years of Trump might look like from a security perspective. Then January 6th happened, and it was like the culmination of all of my worlds. That you had Christian flags, you had neo-Nazi flags, you had MAGA hats. Like, it was all of it all in one place, resulting in over 140 people injured, 5 deaths, and the first time that we've had an invasion on our capital in over 200 years, and the peaceful transfer of power, which is a hallmark of democracy, was interrupted. And on the other side of that, you had members of Congress who initially condemned what they saw, that this was wrong, and we need to be transparent. The election wasn't stolen. And time passed, and a handful stayed there, but you started to see almost within 48 hours, like they were all kind of, I could just imagine what their signal or text channels were. What is the right answer for this? Trying to figure out what was the messaging that they could use when they so clearly were culpable for what happened on January 6th, for talking about an election that was stolen, that wasn't stolen. And you started to see them backtrack. And a group of us that had worked together in the Republican Voters Against Trump Project had a quick conversation. We're like, oh my gosh, they're going to try to memory hole this. They're going to try to pretend this never happened. They're going to try to tell you that, they did within, like, as it was happening, you had people trying to say, this is Antifa, this is a false flag operation. And thankfully the indictments are coming out, and the people that are being indicted are telling them, like, no, I'm not Antifa. So there's at least some record in the court system to be able to point to be like, no, like, if there were Antifa actors, I'm not saying they couldn't have been in the thousands that were in that crowd, but this was not an orchestrated false flag operation. This was the Trump community with about what, according to the indictments, about 13% affiliated with a violent extremist organization like an Oath Keepers or Proud Boys.
Boogaloo Boys. Yeah.
So, but by and large, the majority of those that have been indicted so far were not affiliated. They just were diehard MAGA supporters. So on the other side of January 6th, and watching the Republicans start to retreat from what they initially condemned, we were like, enough. Like, we've got to hold these people accountable. And that's where we came up with the project, which the whole purpose is looking towards that 2022 election, because that's how we do accountability in this country. We vote you out if we don't like you. We don't do it through violent means. And of course, there is a whole judicial system, and if appropriate, if there are criminal indictments, that's for the Justice Department. But the way that the people hold accountable is through our vote. And so we want to make sure that the voters in the districts and in the states where you had Republicans that were willing to undermine democracy are reminded of that over the next 2 years leading up to that next election. And for those handful of Republicans that have done the right thing and it has taken tremendous courage to speak out. Donald Trump has promised to primary them. That means that he's going to try to find a candidate to run against them in their Republican primary next spring. we are going to try to support them and through campaigns and ads and just drawing attention to the fact that they had courage to vote for the country, to vote for the Constitution over their party and over their power.
I would encourage everyone to look up Republican Accountability Project, and in particular, the report that you just published, I think this week or last week.
This week.
Yeah, the GOP Democracy Scorecard. And it's, it's basically what did you do when the Texas AG filed a lawsuit to try to overturn the election? What did you do after January 6th about the Electoral College votes? What did you do about impeachment? There were several things upon which they were scored. My personal representative, Republican Congressman Mike Garcia, got a D- because he raised our hopes when he didn't sign on to the amicus brief. But then January 6th rolls around and impeachment rolls around. And just today, he's using just flat out dishonest language. That's a whole other podcast, but Republican Accountability Project. Now we have some breaking news. You are joining ABC News. Is that right?
Right. I am. I'm starting in May, and I will be a contributor for them on a part-time basis, working on national security, homeland security type issues. Awesome. And Perfect. You have an upcoming book. Yes. You guys are like telling all the news. It is really on the topic that we just talked about, the intersection of these three worlds: my counterterrorism world, the faith community, and the politics, and how that all came to an explosion point on January 6th, and how did that happen, and what do we need to do about it? So I've written a book proposal. It's being shopped around. So
somebody get it.
Exciting.
And let's get this book out there. This is so needed, and so many people are grappling with these issues that will be hot to trot to get that book. So let's get you some writing time. Cabin in the woods. Nice
I like
advance.
Yeah.
And get cracking.
Excellent.
I'm just really excited to see that come about. And then of course you're also have a charity that you would love for people to know about. Tell us more about World Relief.
Yeah, so I have been an outspoken advocate for the last 6 months on some of the immigration issues that we need to correct coming out of the Trump administration. And one of them is that I'd like to see the refugee cap increased so that the United States can return to its historic tradition of welcoming refugees. And the organization World Relief, so if you go to worldrelief.org, they are one of the non-governmental organizations that partners with the U.S. government to help resettle refugees in the country. It's really important, both from a security as well as just a humanitarian perspective, that when people come here from a strange country through usually very traumatic circumstances, that they are welcomed by people with good hearts and hospitality, to just show them the basics, like how to figure out how our plumbing system works, and where to go in the grocery store, and how to navigate the town that you're in. The good work of World Relief, and there are other NGOs that do refugee resettlement. They're going to be in high demand, and hopefully in the next few years, after not having as many people welcomed, we're hoping to see those numbers increase. And so if you have a heart, definitely check out what they're doing.
What if I don't have a heart?
Oh, I have a heart for refugees is what I meant. You have a heart for refugees.
Worldrelief.org. It looks, I just took a look at the page, and it looks like a really, really worthwhile cause. So we thank you for introducing us to that. Worldrelief.org. And I am my heart is overflowing and my head is exploding. There's so many things.
Steam coming out of your ears, Corey.
To think about. So now that I'm getting my shot tomorrow, in about 2 weeks, if I come to, are you in the DC area?
I am. We live out by Dulles Airport.
So I want to come to DC, and I want to take you and your husband out to dinner, and I want to have Jessica and her husband out.
I'm invited. Yeah.
Totally invited. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'll be a long day because I have so many more questions.
Right, Corey? And there's lots of wine, right?
100%. It's a write-off.
No Manischewitz, right?
No Manischewitz.
Only the cabs.
All right. Thank you so much. Wow.
Thanks for having me.
So informative.
Oh gosh, what a privilege.
Edifying.
Thank you.
Yeah. You guys be well and have a great weekend.
You too.
thank you for joining us today. If you appreciate what you've heard here, please go to iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts, give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. That really helps move us up the chart so others can find out what we're up to here. For Ronnie Nathan, I'm Corey Nathan, and we've been talking politics and religion without killing each other. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.